Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 198 of the Manufacturing Hub with me and Dave. Today, we're going to be recapping some of the conversations and I guess the excitement we had last week on Prove It. So, those of you who have not been watching the multiple videos, the clips, the posts that everybody has been releasing in industrial automation, there was a very big conference in Dallas, Texas last week called Prove It, and so a lot of, I want to say, variations or a lot of differences from a traditional conference. So today we're going to recap a little bit really quickly what it was, but ultimately give some of our insights based on the presentations we've seen. We're also going to talk about what it means to prove it, right? From our standpoint, what did it take or what did certain maybe conversations or presentation lack when it comes to proving that they have actually built a tangible solution. And ultimately, we will talk a little bit of what we'd like to see in the future, discuss what maybe some platforms are and what our thoughts are on the general state of manufacturing. But first and foremost, Dave, I think we do need to thank some of the folks that have received us extremely well at the conference. So, of course, the organizers, Walker, Zach, Vaughn, Josh, and many, many more. There's been a lot of members behind the scenes that maybe didn't even walk on stage that have made this possible. And I think that sometimes we don't realize that, right, as attendees or even someone who runs a podcast on site. We don't always get to see all the people responsible for organizing, making sure that everything runs right, making sure that the infrastructure is connected and there's internet and connectivity in this very specific and much needed way. But needless to say, thank you to everyone who's organized. Thank you to the presenters that had us at our booth. And we'll ultimately going to get into the specifics of those conversations in a moment. But Dave, what were your initial thoughts and comments about the conference?
Yeah, I thought it was a fantastic conference. We'll go ahead and get into it. Thank you to all those guys. A couple of high-level thoughts. If you guys aren't familiar with Prove It, if you guys have to not be on the internet for the last 3 weeks, so Prove It is a concept surrounded by UNS, Unified Namespace. The organizers built a virtual factory. They had data, they had machine asset types, and they gave the almost 40 vendors a bunch of this information. A lot of it was intentionally imperfect in order to have them go struggle. They gave them like three or four of the main 5 points of things that they would have found useful. And the plan was to force them to go ask for the rest. And if anyone asked for the rest, they would let them know. I think they gave them two originally. There were five in total. And at most, the one group asked for a third one. So I thought that that was really interesting. A couple of those things I didn't know before going in, and it was a ton of fun. I think there were approximately 20 or 2 dozen different stage presentations from a bunch of these different groups who had to go up there and quite literally prove it. We'll go ahead and get into those. But technically, there were three. I think there were four questions, but the main questions that they had to go on stage is what problem did you solve? You had to the best groups, as we'll talk about, in my opinion, stated early on the problem that they were going to solve. They had to go through the process of solving it in a technical way. And we saw wide variations of groups who did that to varying degrees of success. And then the really painful questions that I loved at the end is one, how long did it take? So, how many human hours or weeks did it take to go ahead and deliver this? And the last one is, how much did it cost? There were something like 64% of the people there were end users. And I feel like we all really appreciated having to go ahead and ask those tough questions of how long did it take? How much did it cost? Real questions that people want to go ahead and know. So all of the presentations, half of them were on the Dell stage, half of them were on the Google Cloud stage. And shout out to Amy Williams and Jeff Winter as the MCs. Those guys got to go up there and ask a bunch of really tough questions. As I told all of them, if something bad happens, if you somehow manage to run out of questions, if Vlad's there, just hand him the microphone, and he will have some questions for them. I am happy to report, Vlad, that we did not hit the in case of emergency hand Vlad a mic, hand Vlad a mic button.
Yeah, I think on that side, the MC format is very interesting. And I haven't watched all the sessions. There's been definitely some controversy on a couple of them that I've watched Amy's response on. So I'm looking forward to seeing some of those sessions and how they were handled again in scenarios where, some of those questions were not answered to the extent that the crowd was looking for. But no, I think the format was great. I think there were a lot of questions also pulled in from the audience. There was an interesting format where you could essentially submit your question and then it was upvoted by the rest of the audience. And then sometimes I think in a different order, but they would be pulled into the questions for the group. And the questions were quite challenging, right? They were not, I want to say, like
They were good questions.
questions. Exactly. So I think it was a really good format to use. I didn't know if that was the original plan. I remember Amy and Jeff asking if that was possible sort of the day before the conference began. So I really am happy to see that they pushed that through. But yeah, I think that was a really good format. If we can maybe dive in on the technical side, right? So this is kind of our thoughts on what it meant to prove it. And so on my side, the first step is ultimately the technical solution, right? So this is before you get to the conference, before you get to present on stage, or before, if you were a bronze sponsor, you get to sort of showcase your solution in video format. You, as they've mentioned, would get a data set, right? And my understanding was that this data was pulled from a real facility. From
Mhm.
what I understand, it was running for 1 hour and then it was looped on itself. And so ultimately, it was showcasing different presses that were, again, I've not looked at the details of what it was collecting from the sensors, but ultimately, it was a real data set, and thus, as you've mentioned again, Dave, it was imperfect in the scenario that it was for the end user. So, what does it mean to prove a solution? In at least in my opinion, so number one, you need to be able to collect the data set, right? And this is a pure technical requirement. Be able to connect to a broker that was on HiveMQ, be able to pull the data, and then be able to look at what information is there. Number two, you want to understand the challenges that specific facility is facing. And this was, I believe, someone commented on one of my posts. Was there, the question was there a clear set of requirements given by the Prove It team to the vendors? And my answer was, in the real world, a lot of times I, as the let's say it as the vendor or the integrator, I need to figure out what the problems are and I need to tell the end user what challenges I can solve for them. So, to that extent, for me, the vendor needed to understand from that data set what challenges were there for the end user, and they needed to figure out a way that their solution was able to solve specific challenges, right? So, what that means ultimately for me is there might be problems that are bigger that you identify by looking at the data, but maybe your specific solution is not positioned well to solve the biggest challenge. So you identify the challenges, you figure out which challenge your solution is best suited for, and you build a technical component that solves that specific challenge. You ultimately need to, as Dave again mentioned, present the cost. So you need to be cost conscious, what the payback period is, and you need to demonstrate, in my opinion, the benefits that your solution will solve beyond just that specific narrow use case. So we'll get into the examples of that, but a lot of the platforms can obviously go beyond solving the data on the UNS. I think it's good also to showcase, well, once we've deployed the solution, we can obviously solve the problems XYZ, but it's also applicable to a greater data set, which you may not have at the conference, and rightfully so because it was in a specific vertical. What were your thoughts maybe on the pre-presentation requirements, Dave?
Yeah, so I thought it was interesting, right? So I followed along, probably not as closely as some people, on the time up and running. And so as we were there, as we were talking to people, I found it really interesting. And we'll get into what we think made good and bad presentations shortly. But for me, I think it's really interesting on the, especially if you offer more than one solution, is do I pick one solution and showcase that solution and build a very specific proven or prove it model along that way? Or do I showcase like my entire portfolio of solutions. And so from my side, I think the people that did the best are the ones that picked a very specific solution and said, hey, looking at the data, this is the type of work that I do. Based upon the type of work that I do, this is what I'm seeing, and let me go build some dashboards. So let me go build some interfaces, and we'll go talk about a couple of groups that did well. And so from my perspective on the technical side, I think it was everyone's best and worst enemies, right? It's your best friend if you focused narrowly on something that you can go explain and articulate and prove quickly so that you can go showcase those abilities. But it's your worst enemy if you're like, I have 1,000 different things that I can do. Maybe let me go do 4 of these on this side and 5 of these over on that side, and go through the process of kind of trying to showcase everything. So on that, I thought it was really interesting. I do not believe, other than the you have to prove something and show it being proven and go down that path, that there were other technical requirements on the vendor side. But I thought that it was really interesting as we went down the path of looking at that and looking at how different people had kind of different perspectives on the problem. Do you have any other thoughts on the technical side before we jump into good what made a good presentation?
Yeah, I guess, look, I guess the format, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, right? But the format of the presentation as we go into that discussion is essentially 30 minutes to showcase your
Hmm.
solution, then 15 minutes worth of Q&A, and then there's a short break between the next session, right? So I think it's important, to your point, to be cognizant of time to present the solution. And if you spread yourself too thin, and again, there was no shortage of vendors that had an entire portfolio, right? Without
Hmm.
mentioning the name, there was a vendor that builds anything from trains down to bus bars and sensors, and so it's very important to pick a solution that is best highlighted with the data from at least that specific challenge from the conference. And
Hmm.
who knows, in the next year, maybe it is a different solution, but ultimately they could have built a PLC solution. They could have highlighted sensors. They could have
Hmm.
highlighted, a SCADA, an MES, an ERP, what have you. So to your point, very important on the technical side, again, to understand what solution you're going to highlight because time is of the essence during the presentation.
Absolutely. And one last comment, re time is of the essence. One thing that I didn't particularly think of before we walked into some of the early ones are people may not know who the company is, right? And so
Yeah.
you have to go introduce your company. And I hadn't considered, because knowing as many of those companies and organizations as I do and we do, I hadn't considered the concept of needing to go introduce yourselves and maybe talk about the specific solution and why you picked that solution. So I thought that that was really interesting. And honestly, Vlad, I'm really happy that I wasn't the one up there attempting to go do that in 30 minutes, because 30 minutes would have been really tight, especially with live coding. And just about everyone I saw did some amount of live coding. So talking about
Yep.
a successful presentation, I think overarching, like it was clear and concise on the problem they were going to solve. So I believe every vendor I saw had PowerPoint slides that they were going through. Some of them had different architectures and other things, but the best ones were clear and concise on this is the problem we're going to solve, either immediately, directly up front, or this is us, this is what we saw, this is the problem we're going to solve, and literally wrote it out on the slide as to what the problem is that they were going to solve. As a bit of an aside, there were some vendors who did some really amazing things, but at the end, I'm like, this is amazing, but I'm still not quite sure what problem it was that they were going to solve. And so for me, that was kind of overarching, talking about the problem that they were going to solve, and then also a clear story on how they went about solving it. So there were some really great groups that did a good job of saying, hey, we can solve all of these 24 problems. This is the one we're very specifically looking to solve today. And this is what we did on the background. And then this is how we're going to go make the connection, look at all the MQTT tags within the UNS. These are the tags that we're going to look at. And this is how we're going to go extrapolate that out. I would say, in my opinion, and again, I think I only watched about 6 of them live, the ones that had really great visuals. I think visuals are really important. So Vlad and I were at the Ignition Community Conference in September, and there were a couple of groups who did a build-a-thon. And one group had slightly better visuals than the other, and that group was overwhelming favorites, right? The other group had some really awesome technical things that they were doing and building. They actually had a wow moment, and most of us were literally Googling what they were using to go kind of set up their SQL databases. But the group that had the best visuals were typically winning. And so I think that's what we saw a lot of are the best groups, the groups that you remember are the groups that had those really amazing visuals. And then kind of the last two is a wow factor. Like it was delivered very well and it was surprising, or it was, wow, this is really awesome. I love this solution. And then I would say, kind of very much on the dynamic duo. All of the presentations that I saw had two people on them. I don't know if some of them only had one person presenting, but all of the ones that I saw, two people were working really well together. One person was explaining the story, and in large part, the other person was literally in the process of writing code.
Yeah, and look, I think you ultimately explain a really good, I want to say, breakdown of why certain companies did better than others. I would say for me, coming from the technical side, again, if I were to look at it as an end user, there's a few
Mhm,
challenges, right? So, number one, I think you need to assume that everyone's coming in pretty much cold into a lot of these
mhm,
presentations, right? They may have an idea of what the company does, but if they're evaluating a solution, the chances of them to have done all the research is probably slim to none, right? So number
mhm,
one, you need to really introduce what your company is able to solve. Number two, which is a question that I actually asked Zach, last time we had him on before the conference, is I think that on the technical side, it's still difficult. So for me, if I don't know the specific facility, if I don't know what kind of machines it's running, if I'm not even familiar with that specific vertical, it is very difficult to just jump into a technical solution. And I trust, everyone's able to pull in MQTT
mhm,
data, right? But I do want to understand how easy it is to build what they're building. And some of them showcase that really well. And then some of them, dwelled a little bit too long on, hey, like we're setting up these connectors and hey, we're seeing this data. But again, without context, it's not extremely easy to understand via such a short presentation. So to your point, you need to be cognizant as you deliver, I guess, this pitch. Maybe you focus on a very narrow area that
mhm.
sort of like wows the audience, and then you incentivize them to some extent. Like, hey, our booth, we can show you a much more in-depth presentation because chances of them being in the same industry and obviously having the same data are very little.
Mhm.
So then you can have a longer conversation on what kind of problems your solution might offer for their specific use case and get a better understanding of what they are. That's kind of how I would approach a successful presentation.
And I would agree with what you're saying. I think that the one super amazing thing about this was the fact that everyone had the same data set. Everyone was working on the same virtual factory. My understanding is that everyone got to have a or several conversations with with the people who have actually been working at the facility. And so everyone was on as equal footing and as equal ground as possible. It was the now go ahead and showcase what your solution is. And while we had three IIoT platforms, right? And we had several hardware vendors, and while we had several industrial data ops groups there, I think it was very much the let's see what you guys can go ahead and do and build, and how much do you really know the solutions and the pain points that your customers are going through.
Absolutely. And I'll pull in this comment maybe as the last thought again on what makes a successful presentation. I'm not sure why it's not pulling in the name, but basically, Mark is saying, as an end user, I thought the best presentations were presented akin to an end user perspective, i.e., they found a specific issue using the data. They were thinking like a process engineer at the factory. Tulip was the best example, and we'll get into the specific companies in just a moment. But yes, I agree absolutely that again, like understanding the problem, being able to present the problem as someone on the plant floor versus having a higher level overview was extremely important. I would also say, for me, Dave, what was interesting to see is that some companies pulled in data from other sources,
Hmm.
i.e., other companies, right? Which
I
also
like
made it
that.
exactly. I think it makes it a bit more interactive. It showcases the fact that you're not very rigid in the approach. You're able to dynamically pull in data, whatever that looks like, and ultimately showcase that your build is modular, right? Like a lot of times,
Hmm.
and you know this better than anybody, on Ignition, you're going to be building an application for multiple sites. If a new site is spun up, if you don't have that flexibility to just pull it in automatically, it is an inconvenience. So I think the fact that these apps are showcasing modularity is a very strong selling point in many of those cases. Let me ask you maybe what or let me start off on the thread of unsuccessful presentation, right? And I think again we'll put the caveat again that you and I have watched, 4 to 6
Yeah.
presentations total in person. The presenters said that they will be releasing a lot of those. I have checked a couple of days ago, they've not been released yet, but there will be recordings to rewatch, at least for everybody that attended the conference. So I'm definitely going to be catching up on them. So keep in mind, my thoughts are based on the presentations I've seen, and ultimately some of the conversations with the vendors as well. So, what made question mark a unsuccessful presentation? So, let's start again, like on the technical side. I think, and to Mark's point, right, that he makes, that they understand the end user. I think that for me, it revealed I guess, a problem where certain vendors, I feel their complete go-to-market strategy is so reliant on integrators that would be boots on the floor with the end user, that they were not really good at identifying the main challenges for that specific data set, right? And I'll put another caveat to that, right? So there's obviously companies from different, I want to say, layers of the verticals or different components or solutions. So obviously building a solution that showcases hardware, or showcases maybe a historian, or showcases maybe a CMMS or a SCADA versus an MES is going to be different, right? So there's going to be different challenges. But I think the point for me is, number one, if the vendor is unable to recognize the problems as if they're approaching an end user and working with data, which is, for better or for worse, not going to be perfect, right? And I feel like we've discussed this many times, but the reality of factories that we step into is that we need to tell almost the end user how to, I guess, pull in that data or manage that data or manipulate that data. So they certainly had that opportunity if the data was not perfect, and some of them did better than others. Showcasing the entire portfolio of products. Again, I think we've discussed this. You only have 30 minutes. So if you're going to spread yourself a little bit thin, it's going to be difficult to showcase something specific. And I think, again, because maybe this was a first iteration for some, they have certainly gone down that path. Um, Not clear on what problem they were solving. So again, this is, business versus tech. I think that it's important to be cognizant that a lot of people in the audience were decision makers who were not necessarily concerned with how you're going to connect to the data, how you're going to store the data, and how you're going to present the data. They understand those questions, or they understand those concerns. They were looking for a tie back to a business use case and a
Hmm.
story that showcases this is what it took, this is what the challenge was, this is how we solved it, and ultimately, we can expect an ROI of XYZ. So again, this ties back to maybe bad storytelling or just bad presentations, of which there weren't that many, but there were certainly some that could have used improvement. What were your thoughts on unsuccessful presentations, Dave?
Yeah. So I don't necessarily want to say there were any unsuccessful presentations. I think that there were certainly some that were less successful, or maybe there was one unsuccessful presentation and several that could have been more successful. But I think to a large extent, like this is the first year, right? This is the first year. This is the benchmark that all of these groups will be able to go set themselves against for next year. My general understanding is that on Monday, when everyone got 20 or 30 minutes to go run through their presentation, like that was the first time any vendor got to see whatever else was going on with all the other vendors. And my general thought is probably a lot of them threw out a bunch of their presentation and started rewriting, especially if they had a Wednesday or a Thursday presentation, which is what you want to do, right? I think that it
Mhm.
certainly proved that not all vendors are created equal. I think we see a lot of the groups, and especially groups and people that we talk to here on the show, they have a lot of specific industry knowledge, or they go bring in specific knowledge from outside of the industry and they go leverage people who have specific industry knowledge in order to go ahead and be successful. So I think it was really interesting to go ahead and watch those. I'm super interested to go watch a bunch of the other conversations that we haven't seen, and honestly, I expect them to all be a lot better next year. As I told some folks, I have super high expectations on a lot of people. And I do want to shout out Benson from Opto 22. Benson was the first person to go. And my understanding is Benson was the first person to go because there was zero doubt in anyone's mind that Benson would go ahead and deliver an absolutely amazing presentation, which he 100% did. Um, Definitely going ahead and getting us all off to a really good start when it comes to that. And so I think it'll be really interesting. I am hoping that next year the stakes are higher. We're all judging them a little bit harsher. And I feel like we had one just fairly apparent group that didn't do very well. And I feel like there were a couple of other groups that I went and I talked with, not on the large stage, that I'm not sure if they necessarily hit the entire goal of this is what we're going to showcase, this is why we're here. It's more like, hey, we're showing how our platform does X at this layer in the stack. Now I will say, with the caveat of, it was me as Dave going and asking these people, some of whom I know, some of whom I don't know quite as well. And so I might have gotten a different presentation or pitch than some of the end users were. But overall, it was very interesting to see the groups going and seeing kind of the differences in the pitches and the presentations. I do want to give one shout out to everyone who showed up. All of the people who spent, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 human weeks in a not insignificant number of tens of thousands of dollars to go bring a booth, show up, go build some of these technical solutions, and be willing to go absolutely get grilled when it comes to questions. And again, I think they were some of the best questions that I've heard. Right, they're questions that Vlad and I want to know the answer to, which means that they're questions that everyone wants to go know the answer to. And I think that was a huge win overall for the conference, is normalizing the tell me how much it cost sort of situation, which I generally understand might have been a bit uncomfortable on first blush for the vendors. Vlad, before we get into some specific groups, a couple of shout outs. Do you have any other thoughts on successful versus unsuccessful presentations? Or what
I
does it
think,
mean to
look,
prove it?
I guess, look, the numbers from the group. I watched Walker's recap after the show, which they've posted on 4.0 Solutions last night, and so the official numbers were 17 were really good,
Hmm.
14 were mid, and then 3 to question mark 4 were not so good on proving it. So again,
Okay.
I've not watched all of them, so I'm going to see what that truly looks like.
Hmm.
But I think it's very interesting, right? Like the numbers, or I guess the bar has been set, I
Hmm.
think, fairly high. And to your point, I think that we will be able to push the bar next year. And I
Hmm.
think there's definitely a lot of learnings and interesting solutions that came out of this. But no, let's go into specifics, right? We've certainly spent a bit more time with certain groups than we have with others, so maybe we have better opinions on what they've presented going forward.
Absolutely. So let me start out by, and it's almost a negative to every other group that is not Tulip, because Tulip was the first group that Vlad and I got to watch on Tuesday. And as I told Eric and Mark when I talked to him after the presentation, guys, I thought your presentation was really good. That is 100% what I come to expect. Having gone to Ops Calling, having watched the company grow and seen all the presentations and other things that they do, 100% of what I expected. And honestly, guys, they laid down probably it is very realistically, or at least debatably, the best presentation that was there, because as Mark said in the comments, They talked about a very specific use case. They said, "Hey, we found 90 anomalies of data or of material movement in the month of December." The,
Yeah, I
the
remember
end
that. Yep.
customer, the end customer had to go back and check. I don't know if you heard, Vlad. The real answer was 89. Right, so they found 90 in the 1 hour of looped data. The real answer was 89. They went and they built a specific set of interfaces, and they're like, "This is the problem as we see it. This is how we're going to go through the process of solving that problem. Here are the 10 interfaces that Mark built over the course of like 3 days. And this is how they would go about implementing it for a fairly insignificant number of dollars and a super insignificant amount of time." And I think Mark and Eric just absolutely killed the presentation. I thought the visuals were they were probably the best visuals I saw, at least on PowerPoint slide wise. And again, I think it was fantastic. I really appreciate them picking a very specific problem and going and solving the problem. I'll let you go ahead and throw your thoughts on it, Vlad. But the last comment I want to make, and why I think debatably that they won prove it, is because the actual end user was in the audience. And at least as of Wednesday evening, there was only one group that they wanted to talk to, and it was the guys from Tulip, because it was still a problem at their facility. And I think that I think that's amazing. I think that that is what you have to go and you want to be able to go ahead and showcase in there.
Yeah, look, I think I definitely agree. It was a really good presentation and a good solution. I will, I guess, like reiterate my caveat from earlier, is I think that Tulip's solution lends itself very well to that specific site and data set, right? I think
Hmm.
for the credit of other companies, if you were to come in with again a vendor that has a hardware product, it would have been very difficult for them maybe to fit it into a narrative that showcases it as well as Tulip did, because their platform again is aimed at that specific customer. So I think it's also important to realize that other presentations may not have been suitable for that specific need because simply they
Hmm.
do not fit that specific data set. But I agree that obviously, if you have an interesting data set, it's your kind of ideal almost customer, and your platform solves some of the biggest challenges that they're facing. It should result, or you should expect a good presentation from that team, which they have delivered.
Absolutely.
Um,
And I will say before we get deeper, it's my understanding that all of these groups signed up long before the actual virtual factory was committed.
right,
Was committed of this is what we're doing, that this is what we're building. So they all signed up to go ahead and showcase their wares, knowing that they didn't quite know everything that was going on. And 100%,
right.
like there are some groups who were because of the solutions they make are better set up for success on virtual factories such as these than other groups. But yes, everyone was given the same opportunity, the same data. It again very interesting to see how some people went and built solutions in one direction that was very different than some of the other groups.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, I guess like to move us on to another solution that was interesting, right? The other caveat also is that the bronze sponsors were ultimately not presenting on stage, but rather filming a presentation at their booth, right? And they've certainly,
Mhm.
there hasn't been a shortage of interesting solutions within sort of the bronze sponsorship area. And I think it's important to talk about them, right? And I hope, again, those videos will be released at some point. I know that they certainly have been filled, but I guess, in my opinion, maybe there was a missed opportunity for those sessions. And to be quite honest with you, I don't know how you'd fit it into the schedule because it was already a very long,
Mhm.
3 days, but maybe
Yep.
something to think about for next year, right? Maybe how to
Mhm.
better showcase some of those, or maybe they pre-film their presentations and you can
Mhm.
watch via like mobile app, I don't know, before, after, whatever.
Yep.
But just something to think like logistically, because I think people have certainly done the rounds of the bronze sponsorships, but I would assume those that wanted to see all the presentations, there simply
Mhm.
was not enough time to spend on that side of the floor. But moving on to a specific example, and you and I have spoke to the folks of Tatsoft, right, which
Mhm.
again is quite frankly a competitor to Ignition, right? And we've seen Ignition present on stage together with Cirrus Link, and I think nothing but spectacular in terms of presentation. But I think Ignition was used by many vendors, so I don't think we've expected them to
Hmm.
be nothing short of that. But TatSoft was a very interesting example, right? Because they built a solution on the .NET or the C Sharp language, I guess, if you want to call it that, and ultimately have quite a technical background from their
Hmm.
founders and a very interesting SCADA slash MES that is extremely responsive across many devices. And so I actually spent a lot of time at their booth discussing and looking at the demo before
Hmm.
you and I had a conversation with them on Wednesday. So I think it was a very interesting solution. They pulled in, speaking of pulling in data from other vendors, they pulled in multiple sites, multiple data sets. And I guess you would expect that from a platform of that magnitude, but I think it was interesting to see how they could in real time plot some of those data points, showcase them, and ultimately store in their own like historian database. So I think vendors like that, and these are Walker's words as well. When I was there,
Hmm.
showed a very spectacular approach to UNS, to Industry 4, and I think were very
Hmm.
interesting on at the conference. Besides the main stage presentations that I think have been highlighted a lot more than some of the other ones. What were your
Absolutely.
thoughts on Hats Off?
To go add to that, I agree. I think if there's one negative about the show, is that there's too much stuff to do, which was my exact comments after the first operations calling. Right. So Maddie from the Tulip side, I think her initial thought was we want to give you more stuff than you can possibly do in one day, or more stuff you can possibly do in 2 days. This is more stuff than you can possibly do in a week, and I think they're talking about going bigger. But I 100% agree when it comes to the bronze sponsors. I saw less than half of them. I certainly saw less than half of the presentations. I went and said hi to a bunch of the folks that I
Yep.
know and a bunch of the people that I know from other places, but did not have a chance to. I had a chance to go sit down for six-ish of the main stage conversations. I did not have a chance to go ahead and sit down with a bunch of the smaller ones. So I'm absolutely excited and looking forward to seeing that go. I would, and I mean, we're 36 minutes into this show. So if anyone is looking at Prove It 2026 and considering sponsorship levels, I 100% would suggest go sponsor a level that gets you on stage. Because going and getting yourself on stage is going to get yourself in front of probably 500 or 600 additional people than someone has to go say, hey, I want to talk to this group, and then from I want to go talk to this group, okay, which thing am I going to miss? And then I show up and then we have the conversation, or they watch it on replay. So that is my comment to 2026 Prove It hopefuls. I honestly think that there are going to be a lot of people who want to go to Prove It that are not going to make it in 2026 if we limit it at 1,000 people and we limit it at 50 vendors. Having said
Let
that,
me, Dave,
eh,
let me throw in a different idea on that same side. If any of the
okay.
vendors watching this is interested in a long form showcase of what they've built, I'm not gonna sign up Dave for this, but if someone wants to come in and have a longer, 2, 3 hour conversation where I will grill them on some of the solutions that they've built specifically for Prove It, do send me a message. I would be interested in that conversation. I think, again, to your point, Dave, it's difficult. I think as a technical individual to get all of your questions answered, even in a 15-minute Q&A. So if anyone wants to have that longer format conversation, definitely interested. And we see Nick in the chat who was there with maintaining talk about that a little bit as well. Dave, do you have any other comments, or would you want to be part of this long form technical conversation that we might have with some of the sponsors coming out of Prove It?
Once again, I withhold all comments on Vlad committing me to 3+ hour live streams. Having said that, but no, I thought the Tatsoft group was absolutely fantastic. I loved that. We'll get in a bit into platforms and what is an IIoT platform, including frameworks. Frameworks version 10, I have now been able to understand and learn the difference and how to say it properly. Thank you, Mark and Harry, for that. I guess just a couple other examples of groups that did a really good job that we absolutely should go ahead and shout out. And then a couple of shout outs before we get into some more specifics is the Litmus group. Litmus, I know them very well. I know Dave McMorrin exceptionally well. Again, one of those I expect nothing but near perfection from him. And I don't know if it was Vatsal or whomever was up with him. They announced Litmus AI. Super excited about that. We'll get into the weeds with them at some point in the future. Again, as my comment with Walker on our stream last week, my only surprise is they stopped at deploying 3 sites. I commend them on the restraint for that. Beyond that, HiveMQ launched Pulse, which is a shift away from their like historical broker into more of a data management platform. I think that's really interesting. We
Did you see
100%
the
at some
presentation for
I did not
HiveMQ?
see the presentation because you and I were taping during that presentation. So I didn't see the presentation, couldn't tell you about the presentation, can tell you everyone was
Yep.
buzzing about Pulse. Having said that, we 100% will at some point, probably second quarter, once we know what all this means, bring someone from HiveMQ, maybe Ravi, maybe someone else on in order to say, hey guys, what does this mean? And be able to go from there. And then another shout out is Remus and Concept Reply and Snowflake, absolutely crushing it with a live build of an LLM into a chatbot, which was very late. I think he started at like 6 o'clock on Tuesday. So if anyone wants to say, hey, you guys didn't go long enough, 6 o'clock was a normal, we still have people going up on stage sort of time. And it was generally full. It was basically full room
Yep.
wise the whole time. So definitely honorable mentions to all of those folks. I saw none of them in person. 100% excited to go watch them live. To go watch them live on tape release.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of very interesting announcements. You've mentioned one, HiveMQ. I spoke a little bit to Dominic the next day, and he was very excited about I guess, the release and how everything went. So it's going to be great to catch up with them maybe down the road in the future on Manufacturing Hub. The other comment, right? So this is our next kind of bullet point is on the integration side. So we've mentioned the fact that there were different vendors of different layers of the stack, different solutions, different platforms, and we'll get into that in a moment. But I think integrators played a very interesting and different role than what we saw from the vendors, right? And the reason for that is because ultimately, number one, as an integrator, I think you're the closest to the end user, right? So you're ultimately going to be working with end users, boots on the floor, understanding the problems. So you're very well positioned to solve their challenges. Number two, you're usually, I don't want to say that you're agnostic, but you usually have multiple tools in your toolkit. So you're ultimately going to be, again, as we mentioned, when you look at the data, you can select the right tool. Is it going to be a SCADA? Is it going to be a CMMS? Is it going to be a visualization layer? Is it going to be a cloud solution that's going to pull that into an LLM? I see Remus is in the comments, but ultimately, I think an integrator at the conference is almost like a best in class position for whatever is thrown at them, after they've signed up. So I think that we're looking to highlight a couple of guys that we saw at a booth close to where we were filming, which was Mac Controls. But there were a couple of companies in there. Was here 4.0 Hero, as well as the Dave is wearing the hat, JPI Solutions, who is Dustin. So it was Dustin, Trent, and Brian, and they had a bunch of different controllers. Which again, I think not every vendor is able to utilize, their competition in some of these showcases. But they've showcased a real environment where you could pull data from different controllers. You could put that into different historians. You can store that in different databases. They ran different IPC solutions, ultimately edge nodes. They also ran a cloud solution, which showcased some of the United Manufacturing Hub type of software. So I thought it was extremely interesting. I've, from talking with them, understood that they have gotten a ton of work from the conversations they had with the end users and other, people at the conference. So I think being an integrator at Prove It is extremely valuable. And again, I have some thoughts on how I think integrators can work better with vendors in the next iterations of the conference, but that's something maybe to be discussed a little bit down the road. But I think it was very interesting, and
Absolutely.
these guys have shown it.
I want to just go add to that. I think what Brian and Trent and Dustin and Gordy did was absolutely fantastic, and I think they very much stand out because they took a completely different approach than everyone else. Right, like everyone else is your some portion of your path into having a UNS. These guys are what does the first 4 to 16 weeks look like, and so I thought that that was really interesting, depending upon the maturity of all of these different groups. I thought that was really interesting. Vlad and I went and we got to go hang out with those guys. It was what, Thursday at like 8 o'clock, and we realized that everyone else was packed up and gone, and we were still sitting at the booth talking, which is always fun, right? It was absolutely always fun, and so we got to go hang out with everyone. I think that they did a really good job. As Vlad and I have discussed, I think being an integrator could be really fantastic, but I think on the other side, it could also be really dangerous because you have to go pick which of the things that we do we want to showcase and how are we going to showcase it, and the larger it gets, the larger you are as an integrator, the more specific choices you have to make. I'm just gonna go speak it into so Remus says that he wants to have a deep dive. um it's going to be a thing. Vlad says we'll schedule it, so we have I don't know, first taker, first victim. We will see how it goes. I'm not sure I'd get a word in edgewise between the two of you if if we are being super honest here, guys. But I'm excited to see what that is. Go drop some LLMs, go rebuild or build the chatbot. There, so Remus is saying a lot of people had questions how we taught the chatbot to know how to calculate OEE. Would be fun to walk through the YAML file creation on the backend code of the Streamlit app. I'm not familiar with the Streamlit app, but I think that would be a lot of fun, and that's absolutely the educational stuff that we always want to talk about, and kind of the very goal from the beginning of Manufacturing Hub, in order to be able to go and share and showcase some of that knowledge.
Yep.
Um, Vlad, I'm gonna do some overview of some solutions fairly quickly. Did you have thoughts on other things before I go and hit some showcases on these solutions?
No, I mean, like, just to reiterate to Remus's point, I think there's a lot of technical questions that I think are very interesting for the audience, and I'm sure he was able to showcase that maybe to people that came by the booth, but ultimately on stage with 30 minutes, I think it's very hard to answer some of those questions, being able to like pull out
Mhm,
the files, being able to pull the data. And I think that's why in some instances people are almost skeptical when the solution is too simple, right? Because
mhm,
I need to understand as the end user or as the integrator, what is it going to take, right? What are you going to need from us? And I had this conversation on a very slight separate note, right? When someone tells you, well, we can showcase a solution for you for free, that's fine, but that doesn't mean that I don't need to allocate resources as an end user to making sure you have the right data. You're able to pull out that data in a way that is, scalable and secure. So that's why maybe Remus has received those questions, which I think are
mhm.
interesting to explore in detail. And like I said, I don't think can be done in a 30-minute presentation. And if you again to your point, Dave, if you get lost on that track, then you're going to miss the mark on the successful highlights in that time frame. But no, let's go into the overview. I'll reach out to Remus. We'll schedule something as a conversation and follow up on that side.
Absolutely. So, a couple of quick comments and overviews of some really cool solutions. And before that, just a shout out to how international the contingent was. I've said this before. I think on Sunday and Monday, we were hanging out with a bunch of the guys from Ireland. I think there were like 12 guys from Ireland. The island, I need to specify, the island of Ireland. I think there were like 12 guys from the island of Ireland there, which is really cool. We got to hang out with a bunch of those guys. We've had Mark O'Donovan on the show, and it was really awesome. It was the first time I got to meet him in person, and we got to meet a bunch of the other folks from Ireland as well. It was super cool that it was such a large contingent over there. There was a fairly large contingent of 3, 4, 5, 6 guys from Austria with ETM, the group that made Siemens WinCC Open Architecture. architecture. They had a really cool presentation with Sofian and with Caleb Eastman. Caleb has been on the show a couple of times, and we've like super gotten into it. I think Caleb and I once again were the only two Americans at a show who were super excited about module type protocol, MTP. Maybe the only two people who, well, there were probably at least a couple more people who knew what MTP stood for. But so we were super excited about that. We have a show with both of them coming out at some point in probably the next 4 to 6 weeks with Caleb and Sofiane. So it was fantastic to see the Siemens WinCC OA team there. They did a really interesting concept of a behind or beyond the dashboard. And so they got really deep into the technical things of what we can do with WinCC OA as an IIoT platform, which I thought was really interesting. There was like an offhanded comment about how Sofian like built or rebuilt some like MQTT Explorer style application in Node.js in like an afternoon, and now it's just part of Siemens WinCC OA, which was really interesting. Super powerful, super fast platform. They were going and rebuilding the entirety of the UNS on their laptop, live in front of people in seconds. Yeah, that would be a little scary to try to go do that live and hope that the network holds up. I should say the network holding up, absolutely fantastic. I didn't see a single group that was struggling live on stage in the presentation. I know some people did some balancing, cloud versus LAN, but absolutely, it was ripping fast, which was fantastic. So a couple of other awesome solutions. So Travis Cox and Arlen Nipper on the inductive automation and Cirrus Link side were on stage. If you guys haven't seen Arlen do his recreating 60,000 MQTT tags in Ignition in like that, in like a blink of an eye, it was probably eye-opening for all of you to go ahead and watch that, because they did that and they expanded. And Travis and Arlen, both absolutely fantastic presenters. I am shocked they went from Ignition Edge up to a full-blown Ignition Gateway, up to Ignition Cloud Edition, and we're like building additional Edge instances and watching as it populates all the way up the stack. I don't know how they did it in 30 minutes. If we want to be really honest, Vlad, I have no idea how they did it in 30 minutes, but it was really freaking awesome. And then I talk about that because immediately after we had Jeff Nipper and Lenny, whose last name uh, I can't remember, from Flow, and they did an equally amazing presentation that was like basically the exact opposite, right? Travis and Arlen, super technical, talking about the technical things. Jeff gets up there and goes and picks the winner of the Legos that were floating around their booth. And so that was amazing, a lot of fun. They did a fantastic job on that duo going and presenting, and Lenny was doing a bunch of live coding. It was really interesting. Dylan was sitting there. We were sitting there, and Flo was his favorite presentation out of all of those solutions. And that was one of those, I think Jeff and those guys had, I don't know, a dozen or 15 or 20 different things. They're like, hey, we can do all of these things, but we're going to pick one. This is the one we're going to pick. We're happy to go showcase some of these others at our booth, kind of very similar to what you were saying there, Vlad. So I think all of those absolutely fantastic solutions. We could go talk for 10 hours about the 40 solutions that we saw. Any other thoughts before we jump on to challenges and opportunities and platforms and other things, Vlad?
No, I think it's really good coverage.
Perfect. So we want to talk about platforms. So as Vlad and I were getting into this, we decided we'd be most of the way through a show, and then we'd ask some really tough questions. And so I think I said the word platform. And I think Vlad is like, what is a platform? We should go ahead and talk about what is a platform. And then we all agreed that there are different platforms. There are hardware platforms and software platforms, and some things that I would call more portfolios. So Aviva was there. We have not talked about Aviva. Aviva was there. I was really impressed with their solutions when I saw it, but they showcased a ton of different portfolio solutions there. So I'm going to go ahead and say, based upon kind of the conversations we were having, and as Walker defines them, there are three IIoT platforms. The ones we have talked about being Ignition, Frameworks, and WinCCOA. Plus, there are other hardware platforms. Vlad, what are your thoughts on platforms? Where do you want to take the conversations? Do we want to talk about how people are choosing? Where do we want to go with this?
Well, I guess it's important to maybe align a definition, right? I guess you mentioned a couple of names. I would ask you maybe is, let's say, Siemens Industrial Edge a platform, right? Because ultimately, for me, a platform is I guess, a solution that consolidates a lot of different apps under its umbrella and usually spans multiple stacks, I want to say, of the ISA standard, right? So a platform is something that I'm going to be standardizing on, but ultimately,
Hmm.
depending on what my company's maturity is, I can pick and choose different components of the platform in order to go and solve very, I want to say, vastly different challenges using the same platform but other apps underneath that umbrella. How would you
Okay.
best define a platform?
So I think to define a platform, we have to delineate between a platform and a portfolio, right? So
Sure.
I think a platform in what we are describing is a piece of hardware or software that spans multiple things, right? So I think we've talked about an IIoT, so a software platform. I think on the like Opto 22 side, we've got the Epic, the Groove Epic, and that is a platform in and amongst itself because you can go run it as a head only, as a data collector. You can go add a whole bunch of IO to it. You can go run a number of Rio RTUs directly into it, and you can go leverage as that. So I think a platform, as we would describe this, has to be a singular thing that has multiple different configurations. Whereas a portfolio is one company owning a bunch of different solutions. And when we were talking earlier, I was doing my best to delineate the difference between a portfolio and a company's portfolio versus a platform. I would say, like on the Litmus side, we've had several conversations with the Litmus crew on this show, and I've had several off this show. They have their Edge manager, and or they have their Edge, and then they have their Edge manager, and then they've got Litmus UNS, which is generally kind of like a is something that most people who have Litmus Edge are going to use to be able to leverage UNS, and they've got Litmus AI. I think combined, all of those are a platform. It's not an IIoT platform, it's an industrial data ops platform that people at scale are going to use and leverage because it really makes sense for people who have 3 to 5 or 50 different facilities beyond just a single one facility. But if you really wanted to, Vlad, like you could go buy Litmus Edge. You could go, I think they have a historian now. They've got an MQTT broker. Like you could go do a bunch of those things. You could offload some of the historian and you could go visualize it in Grafana. So I mean you in theory could do a lot of those things. I'm not sure that I would with how I'm building software and solutions, but it is possible to go ahead and do that.
Yeah, and look, if we want to discuss the challenges on that side, I think from the end user standpoint, number one, I think there's first of all many options, right? So I think that it's starting, at least from my perspective, to become more and more challenging to figure out which platform is the best for your specific use case, ultimately
Mhm,
because a lot of them solve overlapping problems, right? And so,
mhm,
to that same point, as you grow, I think it still is fairly difficult to shift from one platform to the other, although many of them provide an open architecture, not necessarily open source their code, but an open architecture where you can plug and play certain things. It still is difficult to migrate. I would
mhm,
also say that, on the challenge side, you also need very competent teams, both internally and externally, to help you deploy these quote unquote platforms. And it's not only that the tech solution needs to be solid, you also need those people to be up to speed on the platform and be solid and be able to deploy and maintain and augment the platform with time. And ultimately, I think what's interesting in our industry is that there's so much, how would I say, so many platforms that have more and more capability, but it seems like everyone wants you to be on their platform. And so it's becoming again, it's just the nature of things, right? And I understand the want to be everything, like a one-stop shop. But I
Mhm.
think a competent, or I want to say a very large end user, should be able to some extent to pick and choose different components of different platforms and co-integrate. But I don't think
Mhm.
that's uh, it's easier said, I think, than done in reality. I guess that's the challenge I would make. Um,
Yeah, so I think on the integrator side, right? So if you are looking for a platform to pick, you have to look at the install base, you have to look at your skill set, you have to look at the people who you may currently employ or would like to employ skill set, and probably go pick one, right? And then, as I suggest to most people, go pick the one that your clients are using, right? So go find a client, and if they want X platform, go learn that platform. And somewhere around five of those clients who all are saying, hey, I want X platform, that's the platform that you are growing and building on, because that's where your customer demand is. If you're an end user, it becomes a slightly different equation, right? It becomes, this is where we are today, this is where we want to go. And some groups are single site, single facility. They don't have to go answer or worry or look at those questions about scale. And if you're in a single facility, then you can go ahead and pick whichever platform you want. I think it's dependent upon integrators in your area and skill set of the people you currently employ, and the kind of skill set of the people in your area, right? So if I am building on any of these platforms, I want to look at who I currently employ. And like, let's say I have, let's say we're over here in the US. If you have 10 groups that do ignition and no groups that do frameworks and no groups that do Siemens in your area, you're probably going to go on the ignition path. If you're over in Europe, you're probably going to go look strongly at WinCC, be it open architecture OA, or you're going to look at Unified or one of those other platforms. And if you're a group that does a lot of .NET and C Sharp programming, or you live in an area that there's a lot of tat soft integrators, it makes more sense depending upon where you are in that area, physically and geographically. That makes the most sense for me to go look at platforms. I, based upon my experience, probably 70 to 80% of anything someone wants can easily be accomplished across any of these IIoT platforms, right? It's very
yeah,
much the figure out which parts are important to you, and maybe one group does it a lot better. So I've done a lot of ignition edge. I've put probably 150 ignition edge um solutions at physical machines, and it's because they were super critical, right? And we've had parts where they fail over, and we had to go collect data locally, we had to be able to go run locally, as we were in the process of solving a power issue, as we were in the process of solving an internet issue. And if that's really critical, then you need to have local to the building or local to the facility solutions on any of those. You just have to be able to go through the process of architecting it correctly and understanding what that means.
yeah. And I think Mark has a good point, right? I think a lot of times many of these projects, or I guess initiatives, are to some extent short-sighted, right? So he's saying that part of my business is advising people on what platform is right for them. And there's a huge challenge and tension between picking something that will get started fast or maybe at a cheaper rate, and something that will scale to the ultimate size. So ultimately, again, and we've all, I think, like, dealt with these challenges. A lot of times the initial budget is going to come from one
Mhm.
site, and that team obviously prioritizes what they need best, and then the entire company hears about the incredible solution. They want to scale to 10 sites. It is prohibitive based on the platform. So I think there's a lot of nuances to this, right? I think ultimately that's what is both a challenge as well as an opportunity in our field. I think there's so many options on the market right now. It's difficult to be honest with you, to be completely unbiased, even if you're in a position when you're advising clients. I think to some extent, the platforms that and you will be offering solutions, based on where you've been successful. So I think it's a challenge for many of these platforms to stand out and to figure out if their strategy is going to be to become a narrow solution for a specific, use case or maybe vertical or maybe client, versus be very broad and offer a lot of, very, I don't want to say high level because I don't think that's the right word, but maybe like broad set of applications that aren't as deep as some of the others. But look, let's move on because I think that also is a debate and a conversation we could probably have for hours. I do want to hit on the point of, what we would like to see in the next iteration of Prove It. And again, this is the caveat. This is our thoughts. Obviously,
Mhm.
think the team is going to debrief, get together, and hopefully release their own thoughts and maybe what changes will be made. But look, I'll start us off a little bit. I think that I've certainly mentioned to a couple of them that I think there's opportunities on the data side. My original idea, this was after day one, is maybe to cluster different teams where it's, an integrator, a vendor with a historian, a vendor maybe with a SCADA, a vendor with an MES working together. I since then have rethought that idea because I think it
Yeah.
certainly challenges. And if you're a vendor that relies on a specific integrator, that could be a pitfall. So maybe going back to the level playing field of it's kind of a free for all instead of teams, makes a little bit more sense. But ultimately, on the data side, I hope that they push the solution further than they have this year. I also hope that they will release the challenge a little bit earlier. I hope that there's going to be, again, to involve the integrators. I think that integrators maybe would be tasked to build out certain areas of the solution from which then the vendors can also pull. And I know that was the case, this year as well, but I don't think we've seen as much as we probably could have seen of that sort of integration in this iteration. So my thought is, how do we showcase some of these solutions better to the end user? Because ultimately, as Walker mentioned, that's also what we should all care about, not not necessarily the how to say the delivery or the method, but how does it actually solve the end user's problem at the end of the day and at what cost? So it's going to be interesting
Absolutely.
to see what they say.
I would say to add to that, my understanding is that the goal of this was a phase zero, right? So
Yes.
the first everything that you're going to do, you've got the raw data. How do we go collect this data, go put it in our solution, and go do some amount of visualization so that we can go get to the next phase? And so next year, my understanding is that it will be phase one, right? So we have built this UNS or partially built this UNS, and then from that point, where do we go and how can we go build the next phase of solutions from there? So I think it'll be interesting. I think what I heard is that the goal is to only give them 8 weeks next year. So I would imagine, in fact, gets released later. I don't know if 8 weeks is like hard set in stone or what that is. But I think the goal is for the build to be able to be done in 8 weeks as opposed to like 12 to 16, which was what they had this year. So I think it'll be interesting. I think that there are a lot of opportunities to go showcase the actual builds of that, either through Prove It or through the actual vendors themselves. I had a couple of early conversation with some of the vendors about some of those ideas, and I've got a much longer list that I'm sending over to the team, as hey, this was amazing. Sometimes people can have conversations with me that they can't have with the vendors, or that or something along those lines. But no, so I think that there are opportunities, and I would love to get a little bit of a snippet of, hey, this is what the group is going and showcasing or going and building, just to know what you're about to go and look in, because again, everyone has limited time, and you have to be able to go from one part to the other to be able to go pick out which of the 36 different vendors you've got. And if it is 50 vendors next year, I think they're going to add a day or maybe a day and a half to the conference, but it's just one of those. It's just one of those. It becomes so many things to see, so many things that you want to see, and then that's not even the people who are there, or any of those others. I guess beyond that, I'd like to see it get tougher in 2026.
Yep.
To be very honest, I feel like Amy and Jeff did a fantastic job. I think that overall, as I said last week, and as I said multiple times, the conference was honestly better than anyone could have possibly hoped for. I feel like this will be the standard that lots of conferences get judged by into the future, at least like the small to medium conferences, is hey, we see the ICC, hey, we see the ops calling, hey, we see prove it. These are the standards, right? If you want to run a community conference, it needs to be as good as this. It needs to be as fun. You have to go bring in the people and the vendors and the solutions in order to go through the process of doing that. So I hope that it's bigger. I hope that it's tougher. I would in fact love to see, as we were doing the polling, if we can actually vote if the group proved it or not, either immediately, or like, hey, it's a week later, let's go back and think about some of these solutions. I think you listed like 14 were yeses and sevens were like moderate to 17 were like moderate successes, and 3 to 4 were just absolute no's. Yeah, no, I think that's probably that's probably about right. But again, I hope that it's tougher, and I hope that it drives these solutions even better. Now, I wouldn't be to your commentary. Let's go build these teams. I think that would be fun. I think that it can't just be like a random deck of cards, though, right? Like I think it has to be, hey, this is what we're doing. As part of what we're doing, this is it's these 5 things, it's these 10 things, it's these groups who have come together. Maybe we'll see some of the vendors bring in integrator solutions partners in order to go help build it out next year, and I think that could be interesting. I think that that could be fun. I think that the smallest level of additional complexity on the build side and the descriptions of the build side is absolutely better and is the direction that we need to go. One of the other things that was super awesome that we kind of touched on briefly was all of the product releases and announcements, right? So we had Litmus AI, we had HiveMQ Pulse. Is it Time Data? What's the new database from Flow? Um, there's a new
Time
database from
based.
Flow. Timebase, thank you. That just got released like a week before the conference, 10 days before the conference. Jeff has Jeff has said that they will come on in like I don't know, 50 something days in order to go ahead and share more of the roadmap. But the more I hear about it, the more exciting it is, especially because it's yours for free to be able to go use however you want. Maybe not all of the modules or things they build onto it in the future, but it's something that anyone can go have and use into the future. So I think all the product releases were really cool. Thank you, Vaughn. Vaughn's in here with Timebase. It's one of those things that I should have remembered and have written down in 3 places, just not in front of me. But I think all of those were really super cool. Vlad, we are basically up on our normal time. Do you have oh yeah, nope. Vaughn's in the comments. Vaughn is saying Opto 22 now supports containers. 100% a product release. Yeah, 100% a product release. I believe we've got Benson on one of our shows that's coming out. I believe we at least touch on that a little bit, talk on that a little bit. Again, there are so many product releases that we probably needed to make a list just to go ahead and describe all of them. Again, so many awesome and amazing things that came out. Vlad, on your side, do you have any last thoughts before we tell the folks what we're planning to do next month and to send them on their way on Wednesday evening?
No, like I kept saying on the Prove It side, I think it was a great conference. I think I am very much interested in getting a little bit more involved next year. I'm in talks with some of the organizers through, I guess, Discord and some messages to see where I could fit, and where perhaps if you're interested, Dave, we could fit beyond just doing the show at the conference. But I think it's a super interesting concept. I like the fact that again it's oriented towards end users, so I'm definitely staying tuned on what they're going to be doing. They've mentioned that they're going to start planning as soon as 2 weeks, after the end of this conference. So that is going to be announced, I would assume, pretty soon.
Mhm. Absolutely. Again, thank you to everyone for coming to hang out. We will have coverage of Prove It, taped coverage of Prove It coming out over the course of March. We will once we get those set up, we will go ahead and announce it, and they'll come live either on Mondays or Thursdays, just like your normal manufacturing hub. Next month, I'm actually super excited. We're diving into ERP. So we've had one or two conversations in the past about what an ERP is. We've talked about ERP selection process. The month of March, we are doing a deep dive into what ERP is. We've got an ERP consultant solutions provider, Elvis, who's going to be on next week from Talent. So we're very excited to have him. We've got an end user who's willing to go talk about their ERP implementation experience coming on the second week of March. And so it's going to be absolutely jam packed as we go talk about ERP. If ERP is something that you guys have dealt with, or maybe not dealt with, or maybe not have had good experiences, then 100% you guys need to go ahead and tune in as we go ahead and through and do some of this demystifying ERP. Um,
I will add to that comment, Dave.
yep.
So we certainly have a couple of people in mind that we will reach out to for the week 3 and 4. But if anybody in the audience maybe has some interesting guests that we should absolutely have during the ERP theme in March, send them our way, right? So we're always looking for interesting conversations for people who can speak at a deep level about certain solutions. And if you think they're a fit for some of the conversations we've been having, do recommend them. Absolutely, reach out to me and or Dave, and we will make sure to speak with them and slot them in accordingly.
Absolutely. Everyone, if you've made it this far, thanks so much for hanging out with Vlad and I once again. We will be back to the normal schedule, or continue to be back to the normal schedule, in which we are talking all about ERP starting next week. Continue to stay tuned for all of the continued Prove It coverage as we go talk about those solutions. If you guys have made it this far, you're absolutely awesome. I know most of you in the comments are connected with Vlad and I and following Manufacturing Hub. Please go ahead and do so. If you're one of the folks watching on YouTube, or if you're watching on Vlad's Twitter, please go ahead and follow us along, follow Manufacturing Hub, follow Vlad for all of the new updates and everything that we have coming out. If you made it this far on podcast format, you're absolutely amazing. Thank you guys for doing that. Please go ahead and rate us 5 stars, subscribe, follow along, do all of those things. When I remember to say that and Vlad gets the podcast out on Thursday morning to your ear holes, more of you guys continue to listen along, which is absolutely cool. Until next time, we'll talk to everyone soon.